Hey, thank you very much. And as they say in Monty Python, and now for something completely different. So my work today is going to be looking at the case of worker power, technological innovation, and regional resilience, the case of Industry 4.0. So it's really more, as I came to some attempt to conclude it, more about how we think about technological change and worker power, and more laterally about how this might lead into questions about regional resilience. That I don't explicitly talk about regions, but the regions that I'm mostly drawing from are in the auto industry in the Midwest United States and southwestern Ontario in particular, where the auto industry is located. But I'm setting it within a broader set of questions about how we think about technology and labor. So those are the things I'm going to look at today. So let's look at this question of technological change and labor. So I'm first of all situating within a critique of mainstream economics and resiliency approaches. So if we look at sort of neoclassical perspectives, technological change is largely viewed as an exogenous process, acting upon societies and so forth, in which worker power, especially trade unions, is often seen as an inhibitor and restrictor of technological innovation. So worker John Addison's very good example of that application. Now, this exogenous perspective is also evident in mainstream economics, what they call skill-based technological change arguments, which view declining worker wages as the result of new technology and not shifting power relations in labor market institutions favoring capital. And indeed, there has been a rethinking and critical appraisal of the whole skill-based technological change arguments by not only Michel, but also Gerchensky and Onanen in a recent article in Socioeconomic Review, which I think is worth considering, because I think the skill-based, skill-bias kinds of arguments have really become very dominant and accepted as a kind of dominant narrative. Despite the recognition of the embedded nature of technological innovation by some resiliency approaches, evolutionary economics, a major influence on resiliency, focuses only on the rate of technological change and not its systemic determinants, especially labor market institutions, in shaping the direction of this change. So I think that's an important thing we need to think about. The focus in resiliency approaches is mostly on the movement of labor between firms. So we've seen the city and other kinds of regional scales as seen as the labor market, but not necessarily what actually then goes on once people get into a place of work. And while certainly there's been a rise of home-based work, we have to recognize that even at the height of the COVID, 2/3 of American workers were continuing to go into physical workplaces, right? So we have to be careful that we do not generalize from that 1/3 that was home-based. So we need to think about how this is also playing out with respect to a labor capital relation at different scales. Similarly, in my other home subdiscipline, labor geography, there's actually really, interestingly enough, little research on the labor process itself. And the situated micro-emphasis rarely addresses the necessary dialectic of worker agency vis-a-vis more macro-technological change and employment relations systems. Thus, while there is increasing concern about rising inequality, especially regional, and productivity slowdowns, most geographic explanations rest still on the skill-based bias, technological change, not on labor capital bargaining systems and increased labor relations power asymmetries. And I think these points are relevant to recent business management and regional geography studies of Industry 4.0, which I think largely accept mainstream narratives in its adoption and present technological change as largely exogenous. And so the De Previs and Bailey book is actually a very, very useful one in many empirical ways, but I do think it carries certain degrees of assumptions that Industry 4.0 is a done deal. And it presents technology as a kind of an exogenous force on society, and I don't think it is in either way. So let's turn to what I think might be an alternative. Why does worker power matter in technological change? Well, going back to some more foundational arguments of Marx, in Capital, he talks about technological changes being endogenous to capitalist system, and driven by a dialectic between the forces and relations of production. And also interesting, the work of David Noble and more recently Matthew Vidal have argued that there is this interesting contradiction between the need for increasing coordination of workers to socialize workers, capital needs that, but also to discipline them at the same time, to intensify work, to discipline, to increase valorization. And it's in this contradiction that a lot of technological change needs to be understood. So what is worker power? Well, most people in this room already know more about that than probably I do, but certainly, you know, the work of Arnold Wright and Beverly Silver, who talk about, you know, workers can successfully defend their interests by collective mobilization of power resources in the structurally asymmetric and antagonistic relationship between labor and capital. So worker power is relational. It exists at different scales. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today, and is based on the classic, sometimes it's the trinity, sometimes it's the quartet of structural, social, institutional, and societal sources of power. So worker power is viewed as a critical factor in driving technological change. So Beverly Silver argues that capital uses technological fixes to respond to labor unrest and to challenge organized labor by implementing major process innovations to fix problems of profitability and labor control. And indeed, as Matthew Vidal has recently argued, it may in fact be capital that is in fact fettering innovation. Through its obsession with control over labor. It's not actually allowing the full powers of labor to be fully developed because of this obsession and need for control. So worker power then is contingent on whether technology is labor complementary or labor saving. So there's all sorts of factors we need to look in this, and some of this literature is more in what I would call the mainstream category, but nonetheless, I think is useful when we think about it. So worker power is scaled. We can think about it in terms of state commitments to full employment and redistribution. That is creating effective demand, because effective demand is critical for whether firms think it's in their economic interests to actually adopt technology. Employment protection and co-determined regional local labor market institutions like the Swedish model that we talked about a little bit earlier, which allow this upgrading of workers and sustaining living standards rather than letting them kind of drop off the cliff when there is restructuring. Coordinated wage bargaining and articulation between different scales of workplace and sectoral, and indeed upwards from there. But also at the workplace scale, the ability to have some co-determination on technological and organizational change. So what's the takeaway? Labor and capital can sometimes have overlapping interests in technological innovation, and not all technological innovation is directly about labor. But there is also a significant indirect impact of worker power or its relative absence via societal levels of inequality and effective demand, which shape the context in which firms make decisions regarding technology. Labor's positionality around technology must also be situated within the distributional conflicts over profits between capitals. And we're going to see this is very critical in the auto industry, because much of the capital for the new technologies is coming from non-traditional sources who are going to make a claim on the profit and value that come out of that, on top of what labor and capital within the workplace will have, and is ultimately bounded by overall rates of profit. But what I'm also going to argue here is that labor may also have the capability through its experimentation, and especially its alliances with the state, to move what those boundaries are, that they're not necessarily always absolute. They're temporally and spatially flexible, and labor's agency is critical in this. So where are we at a kind of global scale? Overall, current conditions supporting worker power are fairly weak at almost all scales. We have a global surplus of labor, with obviously some local and other shortages, and we'll talk more about that. We have capital mobility, union decline, wage suppression is occurring in a context of neoliberal financialization, which is shifting profits to firms with low labor counts and low propensities to invest. So especially finance capital, some of the information technology firms. This is resulting in greater inequality and thus weaker consumption growth, and thus overall lower technological investment and productivity. And so a lot of the evidence is saying there's in fact been a lower level of productivity, a lower level of capital investment in both hardware and software over the end of the post-war boom till now. And indeed, the sense that there is a skill bias in technological change is actually likely to exacerbate inequalities in the workplace, as well as through technology, and indeed, arguably will slow down technological adoption. So declining worker power is thus just as much a cause of lower investment and productivity growth as it is an outcome of this particular process. Okay, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time in here. Industry 4.0, we have the usual suspect technologies, and we have all sorts of business-led kinds of perspectives talking it up, all this potential value creation potential. But I think what's really important here is that we need to go beyond looking at Industry 4.0 as simply a defined suite of discrete technologies, but it's being argued that it's an organizational paradigmic break with lean production. Okay, so that's an important argument that's being made, that it's going beyond just the physical technologies. It's something that's different in a more profound way. So we have all sorts of these predictions of need for less capital, more automation, more ability to track and control quality throughout the entire supply chain, and that this is going to drive new skill needs and so forth like that. Certainly, however, Industry 4.0 presents firms with uncertainties and challenges. There's a lot of documented ongoing problems with technological and organizational integration. So even McKinsey points out that less than 30% of these experiments are actually able to produce value at scale. The failure rate is actually in some cases even higher than this. And this is opening spaces in the minds of many people within employment relations and labor relations, that the need for worker representative input also on the shop floor, but maybe at other scales. Okay, so there's a lot of kind of work that's being done on that. And so we have a number of examples that are going on in the auto industry in North America as well as Europe. Contracts that are looking at the establishment of joint committees on taking new technology, electric vehicle infrastructure training program, which is a joint initiative of unions and firms and governments in the United States. We also have in the German case, drawing on the co-determination model, where there's extensive intervention into digitalization projects by trade unions and works councils. That Gerhard Bosch has examined. Okay, so let's look what's happening in North America. Notwithstanding such predictions and experiments, there are significant problems with the Industry 4.0 narrative side, the failure rate, and other kinds of things. First of all, there's been, of course, a fair amount of investment, and we cannot deny that that's going on. So just around the electric vehicle, automated vehicle investments, at least $117 billion. In the supply chain, as well as the workplace and so forth. However, we're going to see that OEMs remain relatively reluctant to increase capacity because demand is still fairly limited in the auto industry. So we have to remember that while EV and AV is going to grow, that's coming also, it's a net after we lose the internal combustion engine, okay? And so we need to be careful about these rosy predictions and projections. There's considerable technical challenges confronting final assembly automation. Almost all of the new investment that's going in is in so-called body in white, places that were already highly automated. You see that's where the robotics are and so forth like that. It's not going in to areas like final assembly, which remain pretty labor intensive. And there's a lot of limits on cobot technologies. So again, there's this kind of talking up of cobots as this ultimate answer. But in fact, studies are showing that there's a lot of limitations on what they can carry, if they're going to crush a worker as they run along in a kind of with outside of their cages and so forth. There's also really significant cost challenges for North American suppliers, and it's been fairly well documented by Susan Helper, the International Labor Organization, and Carrie Mordew did an extensive study in Southern Ontario as well, that there are really big cost challenges for especially second and third tier suppliers to take up this. There's also evidence that lean manufacturing and Taylor's paradigm is still dominant. It's actually inflecting the way in which technologies are used. So there's an interesting study from the Center of Automotive Research in Michigan, Atelier, say that new equipment is being used in much the same way as old machines. Okay, so they're not really changing the paradigm, they're just simply inserting the machines in the ways in which they've used it before. So where's worker power? So if we look at the assembly sector, labor is actually only about 5 to 10%, in fact, of total production costs. In fact, Unifor estimates as 4%, right? So we think like, why should labor be the object of attention if it's at this low? But in fact, there's good reasons, as we're going to see why. But leading up to that, we've seen the depressive effect of low Mexican and Southern US wages, the creation of lower tier workforces, and overall decline of unionization and auto worker real wages. So the UAW says that adjusting for inflation between January 2006 and January 2021, average earnings, hourly earnings for production workers in auto assembly declined 21%, and auto parts they decreased by 19%. And the figures this year say that's actually even gotten even worse with the rate of inflation. Also, what we've seen is that OEM's ability to increase labor productivity via process innovation, that is just squeezing labor through intensification, actually gives them less incentive to make technological investments, especially in more labor-intensive final assembly. They can just squeeze labor 2 or 3% added in productivity per year. Why invest in technology when you can get those kinds of rates of increase? Overall, and this is the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the United States, a study that they did in 2018, automotive capital investment increases are due more to outsourcing and work intensification than to actual investment. So again, Fiore and Atelier firms are adopting this technology, do not seem to be using the equipment to its full capability. Instead, companies tend to use automation to substitute for the shortage of workers they are unable to find at wages they are willing to pay. Now, unionized workers have some technology negotiation rights, but these are mainly late in the implementation stage, not in design, and they concern mostly after the fact employment protection and training clauses. They're not about that design stage and so forth, although they are talking about it. Despite experiments, most Industry 4.0 related skill expansion is concentrated in the skilled trade segments. We're seeing much less of this in semi-skilled workers who are often precarious, often workers of color and females who are most at risk of automation-related job loss. Overall, the evidence tends to suggest managers continue to ignore or marginalize the continued critical role of production employees in technological adoption. In fact, we've seen unions sometimes agreeing to use Industry 4.0 sensor and video technology to survey workers, to intensify work in a further way. So that was an agreement the UAW made before. And so weak worker power and downscaling of labor capital negotiation, thus inflecting automation strategies, intensifying work and lowering costs. Okay, so I want to go through this part very quickly because to some degree, we're in a new ball game with the EV-AV transition. And so that's sometimes presented as like leading to a different kind of paradigm. And certainly some cases like the Center for American Progress argue that this is a win-win situation and that we're going to see reshoring. But reshoring is not a done deal, as a number of studies have shown, because of lack of skills in some cases, supply base up and running. Also, I think, and this is something I want to stress, such investments are placing greater demands on low profit margin automakers. So the rate of investment return is only about 4 or 5% in automotive assembly. So the idea is that can they afford to invest this amount and still secure employment? So PricewaterhouseCoopers did a projected automotive investment of increasing 140%. But they envision no plausible scenario that maintains the current pattern of investment and leads to a viable future for the industry as a whole. In all of their case scenarios, the return on investment is actually going to fall in the auto industry. Also, given market competition, it will be especially problematic for new EV manufacturers such as Tesla to gain a positive rate of investment return on advanced technology. In fact, much of the AV/EV investment by non-traditional venture capital and tech firms, in fact, has recently flattened, while global automotive investment in robotics has declined. And so this is the International Robot Federation said that even before the pandemic, any installations were, the pandemic makes it difficult in some ways to do this, but it's because firms aren't projecting enough increase in demand to justify these kinds of things. So what are the implications for labor? Well, basically using less labor. So Economic Policy Institute, I'm nearly finished, expects that if EV sales reach 50%, and there's no significant government interventions, there will be a net 75,000 jobs lost in the United States. Europe will be 275,000 by 2040. Even with lower content, though, in labor, we're still seeing a tax on labor costs. So Ford is shifting several of its EV models from Ohio and Michigan to lower cost Mexico. They're laying off 3,000 salaried workers in the United States. Battery production, they're having a unionized plant, or at least ostensibly unionized in Tennessee, but it's a right to work state. It's not clear whether that will be really a union plant or whether it will be a union plant in name only. And what we're seeing is that in the battery plants, the wages are at least $10 an hour lower than what they are in assembly. So automotive reshoring can have some links with these, but it's expensive for the OEMs, and these OEMs are going to have to share the value that's created with the non-traditional suppliers of capital and so forth. So as well as in going on with labor. So it's not clear, it's not a done deal that there's going to be significant job or wage gains. And just as likely, we'll see continued pressure on labor. So what are the conclusions? Automotive investments are ongoing, but confront significant technical and organizational challenges in the context of weak worker power, low profit margins, and slow macroeconomic growth. It is not clear that these new investments represent a quality break with lean production and may in fact intensify downward pressure on wages. In this context, there are promising experiments by labor, and I don't wish to minimize those or that they may have some potential, but they confront challenges at different scales. So at the workplace scale, unions and workplace representatives often just don't have the technical expertise to challenge management in a fundamental way about technology. And so that's something that we found, that was found in Germany. And also there's a need to better link productivity with wages, which has been a link that was broken after the early 1980s. And stronger overall unionization and worker association political power is needed to change state and federal policies. You can't have just these little islands of experimentation if you can't scale them up. So it's a political project, it's not just an economic one. So resiliency arguments, to conclude, need to engage with worker power arguments which necessarily involve other scales beyond the region and help address the critical question of resiliency for whom in ways promoting not only technological innovation, but greater equality and democracy. Okay, I'll be back there.